The movie we'll be discussing this Monday night is The Birds, Alfred Hitchcock's 1963 movie, based on a story by Daphne du Maurier. I'm going to talk a little bit about Hitchcock more broadly as a filmmaker, and then discuss some things to think about or look for while you're watching the movie, and that will hopefully provide some guidance for our discussion on Monday night. The first thing to think about, and the question that always sort of comes up implicitly at least when talking about an Alfred Hitchcock movie, is what's the big deal? What is the big deal with Alfred Hitchcock? Well, there are a few things that really make him a unique filmmaker for his era, certainly, and these are things that have led to his lasting legacy, being one of the only filmmakers who was popular sort of in the middle of the last century, who is immediately identifiable by name, primarily by sight, and also by some of the titles of the movies he made, and certainly the types of movies he made, to a huge segment of the movie-going audience and beyond. So let's talk a little bit about why that is. One important element for Hitchcock's popularity during his career and his lasting longevity as a popular filmmaker is that he was an auteur. This is a term that would gain great currency and popularity in certain circles in Hollywood and the American film industry and the critical community of American cinema in the mid to late 1960s and through the 70s and beyond. But Alfred Hitchcock really fit the bill before the term was popularized, certainly in this country. It's a notion that is actually sort of devised and first kind of expressed and promulgated by many of the filmmakers who would start the French New Wave. The thing is, before they were filmmakers, they were film critics and essayists in a journal called Cahiers du Cinéma. And they were huge Hitchcock fans. And they admired him and other filmmakers for the extent to which there was a consistency across all of their works, that there were similarities in theme and style and technique and worldview and genre and mood and tone and things like this from movie to movie to movie. You can say this about filmmakers like John Ford, someone they also admired, but Hitchcock really fits the bill perhaps better than anyone in the history of cinema, and certainly better than anyone who had been making films in the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. And when we think about this notion of Hitchcock as an auteur, the concept comes from the idea that the director is the author of the motion picture. This is an idea not without controversy, because at the very least, it takes dozens or hundreds of people to make a feature film. But the idea was not that the person did it by himself, but that his view, his style, his ideas, etc., permeated the whole production so thoroughly that he was able to communicate his vision so thoroughly to and through the other people working on the movie that in the finished film, it would be apparent to any sort of sentient moviegoer that this was the work of a true artist, a true author, and of that author in particular. And I think it's hard to argue that this is the case for Hitchcock. Another reason that he is so notable is that he did something that we have since seen some filmmakers do. I would say Steven Spielberg does it. I would say Michael Mann does it. I would say David Fincher does it. But there weren't a ton of people doing it in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And that thing is the blending of high and low art, right? The blending of sort of important themes and ideas that have typically and sometimes not typically been the substance behind fine art and painting and literature for, since civilization started. That's the high art, the high culture side of things. But then the low art, or the popular culture side of things, is, the suspense and the tension and the excitement and the allure of some, kinds of, scandalous things or suggestive things, the prurience, things like that. And Hitchcock was better at combining these two than probably anybody in the history of cinema. He knew how to make his movies very entertaining, very engaging, very popular with audiences, but he also knew how to make them about something, about important aspects of human behavior or culture or human nature, and how to present complicated or challenging, I guess is a better word, themes and aspects of the human condition that would give critics and scholars and people who wanted that sort of level of intellectual engagement something to really kind of think about and sink their teeth into. Part of the reason why we all like discussing his movies so much. But that would sort of be wrapped in a, colorful candy shell of suspense and danger and things like that. And this is in part because he came from outside Hollywood, and he was influenced by a number of different cinemas, not just the British cinema where he began his career, but also German Expressionism, where he did some work and had some collaborations early in his career. But it also has to do with his particular view. He thought that audiences and critics were equally important in sort of staking his claim as a master of cinema. And to do that, you have to have something or things that appeal to both sides of that coin, or both sides of that ledger, I guess I should say. And he does that. And the reason he's able to do that is because from relatively early in his career, he's given unprecedented freedom and independence as a filmmaker. Nothing that by today's standards would seem, that particularly noteworthy, but by the standards of studio system with, controlling producers and its industrial approach to filmmaking, he had an extensive amount of freedom for much of his career. And part of the reason he was given that is because he made himself into a name brand, and that allowed him to approach making movies largely the way he wanted to. He also had a very good understanding of genre and expectations and of the audience. He wasn't, I wouldn't say necessarily held us viewers in high regard necessarily, but he had an understanding of what most audiences were interested in and sort of how to get them. He was also very interested in moving toward pure cinema, even though a lot of his films are based on stories of one length or another. He wanted to tell those stories, and he wanted to make movies that conveyed things, that depicted things in ways that only cinema could. That's what pure cinema means. And he was always striving for that. And that his commitment to trying to do that gave his movies not just greater audience appeal and made them visually interesting and exciting, but also really sort of forced critics and others to think about kind of the mechanism and processes of cinema, which was appealing to them as well. And then finally, Hitchcock was an early proponent of subjective camera work. In other words, he didn't much care for the notion that the purpose of placing the camera in one place versus the other was to give the audience a clear view. Sometimes he wanted to do that, but he also very often wanted to use the camera or use an effect or put it in a perspective or combine its placement with lighting and angle and things like that to give us a sense of what the character we were, through whose eyes we were seeing was going through. That subjectivity, that if a character is feeling or thinking something, in particular, then if it's possible and the camera is depicting their view of these events, why not have the shot reflect that? That's what we mean by subjective camera work. Finally, the last major reason Hitchcock is such a big deal is that he puts the personal on display. Now, when we talk about the personal, we can take that to mean things that are of interest to or preoccupations of Hitchcock himself as an individual, specifically. And I think we all sort of, kind of have a general sense that the notion of these, like in The Birds, the blonde leading lady, Melanie Daniels, played by Tippi Hedren, has a certain cold air about her, and doesn't seem to be very receptive or to the man she's interested in, and things like that, and that sort of cold distance that he often depicted his leading ladies having, at least initially. A lot of people would say had to do with his sort of experience with, perhaps women in general, if not certain women, over the course of his life. But more than that, and more commonly than that, and frankly, I think more interestingly than that, the personal on display about people in general, right? He has in his movies things about human behavior that people, in general, people do, but don't want to talk about or think about or admit. Things like voyeurism, or lust, or cynicism, or some sort of weakness, or feelings of vengeance, or feelings of persecution, things like this. And we see those across his films, and we see some of those in this movie in particular, having to do with romantic relationships, and perhaps a mother's view of her son's budding romantic relationship. And those were things that, of course, are, completely fair game for movies now, and have been at least since the 70s, but it wasn't very common for that to be the sort of type of thing a Hollywood movie or another cinema's movie dealt with. But Hitchcock was always interested in those sorts of things and always put them in his movies. As for The Birds in particular, this movie was kind of a big deal when it came out. There were very high expectations surrounding it. It was Hitchcock's biggest budget for a film to date, $3.3 million. There had been 3 years between the release of The Birds and the release of his previous feature, Psycho, which was Hitchcock's longest gap between movies to that point in his career. It was his third film based on the work of author Daphne du Maurier. He made The Jamaica Inn in England in 1939, which critics didn't much care for, but audiences did. As many of you know, he made Rebecca in the US in 1940, his first film in Hollywood, which was both a critical triumph and very popular. And now he was going back to the well, so to speak, for a du Maurier story that was interestingly first published in the United States in 1952 in an issue of Good Housekeeping magazine, which maybe makes a little bit of sense for a reason we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. It is also the most technically complicated film Hitchcock ever made. It combines the use of real birds, animated birds, and really challenging optical effects, including extraordinarily complex compositing, or the layering of different visual elements shot at different times in different places that were to be combined into one shot. A level of sort of complexity of effects that Hitchcock had never dealt with before. He also was really pushing the boundaries with the soundtrack, although people tend not to think about this very much. In Psycho, he sort of walks the line in the soundtrack between music and noise or effects, and he pushes that even further here in The Birds. Then there's the final shot of the film, a shot that Hitchcock considered to be the most difficult single shot throughout his entire career. It incorporates actors and all different sorts of birds, real birds, optical effect birds, stuffed birds. It uses an elaborate matte painting in the background, and my understanding is that 32 different exposures were required for this final image, meaning 32 different elements had to be captured and then combined into that final shot. And as I said, this film does have elements of the personal on display, but it has something that not a ton of Hitchcock movies had. Rope had it, The Wrong Man had it, and The Birds as well has a connection to actual events. There were some unexplained bird attacks that occurred in Capitola, California in the summer of 1961. That was an area in Northern California nearby where Hitchcock frequently visited. He often went to places like Santa Cruz and Monterey Bay, and he heard about the attack because he had a sort of vacation home in that general area, and he actually did some research on it in local papers and things like that. He had actually set the film elsewhere in Northern California in the real town of Bodega Bay, and I guess in a sense, the relatively extensive is too strong, but the significant amount of location shooting was something that Hitchcock wasn't particularly known for as well. He's often set things in real places, but he almost never shot the actual footage in those real places. He wasn't at the UN by and large in North by Northwest. He wasn't on Mount Rushmore either for that film. And here he actually goes to the town of Bodega Bay and uses some of the actual, at least exteriors, in the film. Another interesting thing about The Birds is that most people would agree that this is sort of his last great movie. It is widely believed that after this film, his career declines. He doesn't quite seem to be the same. His health begins to decline. A number of his, sort of long-standing collaborators either pass away or move on. And perhaps most importantly, the culture in the movies change. The edginess that Hitchcock brought to all of his work, or most of his films anyway, and that was really sort of, novel and exciting for audiences, isn't nearly so unique as it once was by the time the mid-1960s roll around in American cinema. The sorts of themes and plots and characters he boldly and cleverly used throughout much of his work weren't so uncommon anymore in this era of changing audiences, changing culture, and changes in Hollywood. And then finally, as I mentioned, his sort of status as an auteur, while he was sort of the granddaddy of them all in Hollywood, wasn't as unique as it had been by the middle of the 1960s. And that sort of set him aside as well. This movie has, I think, some interesting things to say about mothers, which is no surprise to any of you who might be Hitchcock fans. It's interesting because in some sense, this movie is kind of a relatively conventional melodrama with this sort of, horror or sort of supernatural almost element of The Birds kind of, added into the mix. And a lot of people who watch this film think about The Birds as being connected to Melanie Daniels, the Tippi Hedren character's desire for the Mitch Brenner character played by Rod Taylor. And that, this is a woman who is sort of going after a man she's interested in, and that sort of acknowledgement or recognition or expression of her desire is at the time, sort of frowned upon, and culture wants to, society wants to sort of contain that, and The Birds are a response to that. And it's possible. It's possible that that's what The Birds are about, but it's also possible that there's something else going on. Regardless, mothers sort of loom large. There's a suggestion that Melanie is as uncharacteristically aggressive as she is because her mother had abandoned her in the film. There's also a suggestion that Mitch is as sort of challenging a man for her to kind of catch as he is, because his mother, played by Jessica Tandy, is all too present and all too judgmental. We also have the theme here, of course, of the sort of the icy blonde who has a frigidity, but also a sort of a neediness underneath. This is something that Hitchcock has in a number of his films, going back to The Lodger, a silent film based on Jack the Ripper, the Jack the Ripper story he'd made in England decades earlier. Another thing that this movie has that a number of Hitchcock movies have, but isn't usually so commented on, is that this is about a woman going through a transformation. And sometimes that is a positive transformation. A great example of this, I think, is the Grace Kelly character in Rear Window, who, at the very least, if she isn't actually a sort of, cloistered, protected kind of, a delicate model type, that is the perception of her that her boyfriend, fiance, Jimmy Stewart has. And she, over the course of the film, she proves him wrong. And she sort of stakes her own claim as an equal partner in his endeavors. And there's a transformation sort of along those lines that occurs with the Melanie Daniels character in this film. She starts out as a sort of jaded sophisticate, but she becomes more natural, more humane, more earthy in a sense, more organic over the course of the film. Of course, she's put through the ringer in the movie, much more so even than Grace Kelly's character was in Rear Window, but that's Hitchcock's milieu. But the transformation does occur. Another thing we see in this film that we see across a number of Hitchcock movies is the notion of terror in an everyday place, seemingly harmless, at least, or perhaps to many of us an ideal locale, a pleasant, small seaside town. And there's assumed to be a safe and enjoyable place until a taken for granted element of it runs amok, right? It's not a hotel shower, it's the birds that, are sort of naturally everywhere and people tend not to pay much attention to. And in a sense, the sort of avian element makes this source of the threat in the everyday place even more unpredictable and uncontrollable than usual. And of course, this brings us to the sort of the avian metaphor, as it's called in this film. What are the birds? What are they about? What do they represent? And as I said a moment ago, there's some who say that they're a manifestation of the sort of problematic desire that the Tippi Hedren character has for the Rod Taylor character. But there's another way to think about it, I think, and that is that perhaps the birds are a manifestation of Lydia's will. Lydia is Mitch's mother, Rod Taylor's mother, played by Jessica Tandy, who clearly does not approve of the Tippi Hedren character of Melanie Daniels and is deeply disapproving of her and suspicious of her. And while I don't necessarily know the film gives us reason to go so far as to call the birds a manifestation of Lydia's Oedipal desire for Mitch, it's pretty clear that she wants to have some unusual amount of control over his life and to be able to possess him in some way. And the question is then, are the birds an expression of Melanie's desire for Mitch or Lydia's desire to keep Mitch away from people like Melanie? It's an interesting question. Melanie's pursuit of Mitch and the sort of beginning and escalation of the bird attacks do coincide, but is that because of Melanie's, desire for Mitch, or is it because Lydia is aware of what's going on and it's her hostility towards that, her disapproval of that, her jealousy of that? It's hard to say. One thing, to me anyway, that sort of maybe tips the scale in favor of it being an expression of Lydia's controlling feelings toward her son, and this is something you can look for as you watch the film, is the sort of bird-like qualities that Lydia, again played by Jessica Tandy, seems to have. As you watch the film, tell me if you agree that she has a somewhat blank stare, a craning neck, an unusually taut mouth, and see if you think that she has, when she screams at different points in the film out of fear, that they're sort of less of a human scream and more of an animal sound than the screams of Melanie, perhaps. There seems to be some sort of juxtaposition between shots of Lydia and impending attacks of the birds. See if you notice that connection. And then finally, it seems like the way that Lydia, played by Jessica Tandy, is made to appear is in a way to make her sort of vaguely resemble many of the birds, such as the gulls that we see in the film. Her wardrobe and her hair frequently combine shades of or flecks of black and white. The birds in the film are mainly gulls, which combine black and white, or crows, which are black. We see this combination in a few different places. And it's interesting that during at least one of the sort of focused attacks on Melanie, a crow and a seagull seem to join forces, sort of maybe representing the different sort of sides or shades of the Lydia, Jessica Tandy character. So something to watch for, and a number of things to think about while you see the birds, and while you join me, I hope, to discuss it on Monday night. The film is available on a number of streaming services, so I hope you enjoy watching it in the coming days, and I look forward to discussing it with you on Monday night at 6:30. Thank you.